The Graphic Histories Podcast.
I got bit by a radioactive bug. I tried an experimental drug. Went up for a stroll on a gamma testing range. I found an enchanted hurricane. I made a serum that made me small. I modified the serum so it would make me tall. Radioactive isotope in my eyes. Dying alien helped me accessorize. I gained the proportion and strength of a spider. Now I'm invincible and I can fly. I lost my sight, my other senses were heightened. I'm gonna put on my pajamas and go fight crime.
Hey, welcome to the Graphic Histories Podcast. My name is Andre Mayette. Thank you very much for tuning in, and big thanks to Ukla the Mock for our theme song, Superpowers. And big thanks to you, listener, for tuning in once more. It's been an interesting week. I was on vacation for a week and a half, and I'm back now, fully rested and ready to bring you more super fun interviews. Today, our guest is one Jim Zub, who you may know for his work on Skull Kickers, on a bunch of Marvel projects, Champions, the Savage Sword of Conan, his Rick and Morty Dungeons and Dragons, his Dungeons and Dragons comics, his Pathfinders comics, lots of interesting, cool projects that he's worked on over the years, and we get into all that when we talk. I'd like to also thank our previous guest, Troy Little, for making the introduction and getting me the interview. Jim's a super cool guy. A lot of information. He's great at kind of getting you into his world. And he certainly got me into his world, and I really enjoyed listening to his stories and learning a lot about how he made it into the industry and, you know, where it went and how it took him. And he just seems like a super positive, happy guy who's doing what he loves, and I was super happy to interview him. Just got back from vacation, as I mentioned. I'm rested. I am ready to get things back to normal. Hopefully everybody out there has had a chance to go get some time away. In Nova Scotia, we still have some. We have some okay things on traveling within other Atlantic provinces in Canada. So you can travel to PEI, you can travel to New Brunswick, or Newfoundland, although Newfoundland requires a plane ride. So with freedom, so we went to PEI for a bit, and then I went down to some parts of Nova Scotia I don't get to very often to visit some friends. I dropped in on Mark DeVoe, who was a former guest on the show. Hung out with him and talked to him. We might have an iron in the fire down the line for a fun project we could do together. So I'm very excited to get that ball rolling, and it's always great to see Mark. But in the comics world, or in the sci-fi, fantasy, whatever world, I did see The Suicide Squad. Sorry, that's what differentiates it from the previous film. I saw The Suicide Squad yesterday, and it is amazing. Amazing. I mean, I love James Gunn. Ever since I saw Slither, I've loved him. Even the ones he's written but hasn't directed, I've loved. Super, I loved with Rainn Wilson. His movies always have sort of a dark humor, but also heart. You can't deny that his movies have a deep beating heart at the center of their story. And the first Suicide Squad movie I was not a fan of, the David Ayer one, because it really just sort of focused on how cool the mercenaries are, which is fine, but like it sacrificed any kind of heart whatsoever in doing that. It's just like, hey, here's a cool crime story, and there's not a lot of depth to any of it. A little bit, but not much. They threw a lot at you. This one is like the opposite. Characters that you absolutely love, that you can relate to. It actually had me in tears at parts, which I'm admitting a lot as I get older, that movies touch me in certain ways, and this one certainly did. There's a line near the end of the film that sort of sums up the theme, I think, of the story, and it had me in a bit of tears. I'm not going to give any spoilers. I'm just going to give a few notes. One, Bloodsport is one of the coolest designs as a comic character in a movie that I've ever seen. I mean, his helmet kind of looks like a xenomorph from Aliens, and it looks super cool with the whole kind of get up and all of the gimmicks he has with the firepower and stuff. Giant villains or monsters in general don't always have to be dark. That sometimes they can be bright and colorful and still be terrifying. So it'd be nice to see some different designs in the future towards that sort of thing. I mean, I hope they make more of these. I really, really do. It was super well done. I know they're doing a spin-off Peacemaker series on HBO Max, which is coming out somewhat soon. That Gunn wrote and directed as well, so I'm very excited for that. John Cena's a great actor. In this movie, he does a good job of bringing that kind of sort of goofy meathead stuff he has in the past, but also a sinister streak and some good drama when it counts. So Yeah, I super enjoyed it. The soundtrack was fantastic. Peter Capaldi was my favorite Doctor Who, and he was in there as the Thinker, which is great. They had a Pixie song in the soundtrack, so they're one of my all-time favorite bands. So anytime they pop up in a movie soundtrack, it makes me happy, especially when they use my all-time favorite song by them, "Hey," which is the one they use in the film. And I've learned some new music that I haven't really known about. I'm always excited to do that, and some of it showed up in the movie, and I of course looked it up afterwards, and was very happy to discover the Fratellis, which I didn't know much about, but am going to do a deep dive into audiologically soon. I don't know if that's a word. I just invented it. But anyway, go see the movie. It's fantastic. I know it underperformed from what they expected, but I'm hoping it'll still do well overall and give them, the drive to make another one because it is super good. Like, super, super good. And if you love the sort of concept, it really takes it to its nth degree and then some. And I can't deny the heart. That's what really matters, is the beating heart at the center of the story. So go watch it. Anyway, it's enough about me rambling how much I liked The Suicide Squad. Let's get into our interview with Jim Zub.
Hello.
Hello, Jim. How are you?
Good. Sorry I'm late.
Oh, God, don't worry about that. You were
It's just
barely
been,
late.
Well, there you go. Barely late. I'll take it. How goes it?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Pretty good. Where are you based?
Nova Scotia.
Nice.
Yeah, you've ever been out this
You're
way?
a fellow Canadian.
Oh,
This
for
is
sure.
Good.
Actually, I
Excellent.
interviewed Troy not too long ago, and he had put me in touch, so I appreciate him for doing that.
Amazing.
I know.
Troy's the best.
He is. I
I
just saw him.
literally spoke to Troy last night.
Yeah, I saw him about a week ago. We were in PEI
Yeah.
visiting, and him and his wife. had a visit.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a new project, so
Oh,
that I cannot talk about yet, but it's going to be awesome. So we're super excited.
I'm very excited to. I've been waiting for the big collection of the Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, man. It
So-
is a honker. It is a big book. I was surprised. Like when they say oversized, I expect a certain trim size or whatever. And then I got that thing and I went, whoo, okay, this is a doorstop. It's
a
beautiful.
hefty tome. You could club a home invader to death with it.
That's right. Drop it off the third story landing and
right.
kill a small child. Yeah.
I was going to buy one from him when I was there, but he's waiting for the ones with his cover to come in. So I'm going to wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. All
Yeah.
right. So I know you're going to cut all this. We'll start with something a little more formalized, but
Oh no, actually, I like jumping in just when it goes. So that's how I
Nice.
like to do things. If that's cool with you.
Sweet. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Awesome. So tell me about Jim. Where were you? Where were you born at?
So I was born in Oshawa, Ontario. So it's like a little blue collar car town just outside of Toronto. Probably, when I was a kid, it was known because it was the home plant of General Motors and all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of people working at the car plant and things, and a surprising amount of nerdity. We had when I was a kid, by the time I was in my kind of prime nerd years, we had 3 comic book stores
Wow.
and a very hefty amount of role-playing games and all that kind of stuff. So I grew up very proto nerd. My brother, he's 4 years older than me. So whatever he was into, he was just old enough that I thought he was cool and I wanted to be like him, kind of at least till you reach that age where you can't stand each other. But
Yeah.
So he loved, science fiction and fantasy. So I read a bunch of that stuff as well, although I ended up gravitating more towards the fantasy stuff. And then we both got into comic books and we both got into tabletop role-playing games and just the whole 10 yards.
So
really
as far as
crazy.
comics go, what were you reading?
I mean, beyond the typical little kid kind of Garfield and all those sorts of things and Calvin and Hobbes and whatnot, when we got into comics, comic books, it was kind of leaping from Spider-Man and the Electric Company magazines,
Oh, yeah, nice.
Spidey, and then G.I. Joe, the comic series, which I got into big time because I was collecting the toys and playing like crazy with them. And then from there, it was a natural leap over to Spider-Man because I just loved Spider-Man. I loved the cartoons and I loved the Electric Company stuff. And Amazing Spider-Man had this amazing kind of legacy and history that I really loved about the character. And so I just wanted to collect it. And so I was simultaneously started buying Amazing Spider-Man Monthly.
Mhm.
And then in Marvel Tales, they would do reprints of
Yeah.
the older issues. So I would buy those as well and try and buy back issues because they didn't have the kind of trade paperback programs that they have now. And of course, there's no digital. So I was just trying to fill in gaps. So I had that classic kind of collecting checklist where I was trying to get either originals or reprints of every issue
I
to
feel
read
like
Spider-Man. Yeah.
our collector paths seem to go in the same road because that was the exact same for me. Like Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, and those Marvel Tales, and it was
Yeah, big time.
so weird as like a kid in the early '90s to be like reading, these comics drawn by Ditko and all these things that didn't look like the way they are now. Because at that point it was like Bagley and Tom Lyle and all those guys.
But you know what was neat too, though, is there were those guys like Ron Friends who came on to something like Thor, and he did a very throwback kind of style.
Mhm.
And so it felt kind of old school, even though it was recent, in the late 80s and early 90s. Stuff
For
like
sure.
that I thought was really fun.
I felt like Wilson did that too with
Yeah, a little bit. He had that
Yeah.
kind of quirky, yeah, it was really good stuff. So eventually one of the things we glommed onto was the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. That was like
nice.
our because what it did, I think when you're a certain age, I've talked about this with so many different people. I think you try and codify your world, right? And because the world is chaotic and doesn't make any sense, you're looking to both simultaneously push the limits of what are the rules, mess with your parents and all that kind of stuff. But you're also trying to figure out the rules. You want someone to tell you the rules, right? So, kids nowadays, they might memorize all the names of all the Pokemon, or I guess that's something 20 years old, but or they might obsess over whatever they're obsessing over, a recent cartoon or music or sports stats or video game strategies, speed running. Like they're looking for some sort of structure that they can both explore and understand.
That's very
and for us,
interesting.
the Marvel Universe felt like that, and Dungeons and Dragons felt like that because it was a way for us to research this thing. So we were reading like crazy and memorizing all this flotsam, like all this crazy knowledge, and pummeling each other with it, right? And what it did is it because collecting comics at that time, you're buying issue 200 whatever of Spider-Man, but you're reading about the histories of characters from whatever their first appearances in the teen issues of Amazing Spider-Man or something, and it all makes sense. Like it doesn't matter that there's 20 years worth of stories. It all makes sense because the encyclopedia, the Marvel Handbook, tells you this is what Doc Ock did these 10 times or whatever, and you're like, oh, of course, right?
That's amazing. I've never heard it answered that way, but it does make sense to me that like as a kid, because that's I've always glommed on to continuity as well. Because you're right, it orders everything. Like I'm kind of an organized person, so like it orders everything and keeps it in a place that you can make sense of it.
Right. But it's also the thing that sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say one of my biggest complaints with modern comics. Well, I don't want to like name certain companies, but like
sure,
DC specifically, like they rewrite their continuity every other year, and then it's like if you try to explain to someone why Superman is this way, it's like, well, he was this Superman, but then they did this thing, and then he was a different version, but then that one died, and the first one came back, and like it's
there's so all sorts of insanity. Like you have to accept the fact that these stories, Spider-Man is in bell bottoms because it's the late 60s, early 70s, and whatever. You just sort of glom over the fact there's been 10 presidents and 20 Christmases. You just don't think about that stuff. But
and Spider-Man's done a good job of that. The comics generally have like a organic sort of continuity. Like I don't know, it kind of shifts, but it works.
Right. Because the stories that are important for this story are all that matters. If we're going to reference the first appearance of the Punisher, then that appearance matters. Exactly. And otherwise we don't. We don't worry about was he in Vietnam or was he in the Korean War or was he in Iraq? Like it doesn't. He was a soldier. And he went overseas and bad things happened and he came back damaged. Like that's kind of the point, right?
Yes.
And so it's fascinating to me because, it creates all of these barriers borders for you to understand this fictional construct. And it's very exciting to you when you feel like you know it. But it's simultaneously, you realize later on, or I've realized later on as someone working in these spaces, that it's also why people get so ticked off, because if you shake any of those foundations or you change any of them, you're breaking the rules. And it's like, yeah, but that's what the writers did when I was growing up. Like they gave Spider-Man a black costume, and for a while Thor didn't have his powers, so he was wearing that armor, and like Captain America wasn't the captain. He was called the captain for a while because he gave up being Captain America. Like, but when I was reading it, it was in this exciting ongoing story. And then you hit a point where like the detritus builds up and you go, oh, they're changing too much, oh, it's too different from what I recognize, therefore it's wrong or whatever.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of fight that mentality, I think, like both as a creator and as a reader, where you're sort of like, look, this stuff keeps going.
It's a good point though, but I think that like you hit a certain point in your development. Like as a kid,
Sure.
you get a defined boundary of the world, and you're probably looking for some purpose in life or some way to make everything make sense and fit.
Right.
So I can kind of see why you'd fall into that. But then as you get older and like it all seems new and exciting, but then when it becomes too many changes, like today they just announced that Tim Drake is bisexual now, and like people are losing their mind about it. And I'm like, I don't know, like they change stuff constantly. That's comics.
Sure.
Like, why do you like
and the difficulty is trying to figure, everyone's got a different line that if you cross, that's, but I think, and it depends on the book as well. So something like X-Men is simultaneously the easiest and hardest book, because whenever you got hooked on the X-Men, that team lineup is the right one. Yeah. And every lineup before that or after that is messed up. Right. Yeah. Like in your head, you're like,
it's like your Doctor Who or your James Bond. It's the one you find.
Yeah. It's like, why doesn't Kitty have a crush on Colossus anymore or whatever? Like whatever, stick a fork in it, whatever stupid thing you were obsessed with or element of it that really stood out to you. You want it to stay true to that. Right.
Yeah. I actually once, I think it was, Brian Posehn. He wrote for wrote for Marvel. Yeah, he's a stand-up comedian, but he wrote Deadpool for a while, and he had some stand-up bit. And I always reference it when it talks about like these sort of fanboys like getting really upset about them changing things. And it's like, no, man, like it's not that way. Back when it was my day, it's like, the X-Men were this way, and the Ninja Turtles were singing with Vanilla Ice, and mom and dad were still together, and he's just like going through all the happy times of your childhood that you're trying to relive.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. When they, and so your job is this weird thing where you're in this nostalgia factory of working on these properties now. And you see this all the time where certain writers will come on board, and if they get influence, they will try and claw things back to an era that they recall
all the time,
fondly,
constantly,
all the time. And it usually doesn't work because it's moved too far. And so, and the stories that actually stick with people are the ones where you feel like you're moving the ball forward rather than trying to, freeze this stuff in amber or whatever other analogy you want to use. And so I find this weird, you're trying to channel it's something really fascinating that I see in something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they've been able to take certain core traits of the characters or understand truisms about them and update them to a modern era. They also have the benefit and the hindsight of 60 years of continuity, to be able to cherry pick the best stuff. They also have the benefit of being able to go, oh, we're only doing one of these stories every year or so. And so you don't have this constant grind of 12 or more. I was talking to Tom Brevoort about this, and he said, Marvel has the benefit of only having to tell 6 or 7 Iron Man stories, and we tell like 20 a year. So
that's a really fair point. Like they can cherry pick one of the story arcs, and that's enough for a movie, but then you have to do the next one and the next one and the next one. And most of
not all of them are going to hit, and not all of them are going to last, and not all of them are going to work, and not every villain is going to be a classic. And it's ever ongoing, right?
And it seems like the Marvel trend lately is that it's like you bookend your series. When you come to Spider-Man, that's an arc, like your whole series up until whenever you leave the series, like you say it's 100 issues. That's like, that's the omnibus tome that has the whole story with everything in it. So like it's a grander scale than just arc to arc like it used to be back in the days, it seems.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of a feel, right? And so I've got certain elements of the books that I grew up with that I try and inject into what I do, but I also have to be real about what the current market is and the current expectation is, and certain truisms of modern comics, and somehow fuse those two things together in a way that I'm proud of and that I feel works, Absolutely. And it doesn't always, but you try this stuff out. And I mean, it's a joy to be able to work on some of these properties and to write some of these characters. but you are working within a system, that has rules and approvals and all that kind of stuff. And so writing on these commercial properties it's an amazing opportunity, and it's a really cool way to kind of flex your creative muscles, because you've got to figure out how to simultaneously thread the needle on all this stuff, but also make it feel a little bit personal and a little bit, something that you would love as a reader, and kind of check those boxes.
Are you able to
but
shake
then
that
you've also
when you don't?
What's
Like
that?
when you feel like you don't, or the audience feels like you don't, are you able to shake that and move on to the next thing?
I mean, you can tell, like, most of the time. And the good news is that the vast majority of stuff that I've written, I feel like I've got a stake in. Like, I think it's fairly obvious when I'm halfway checked out, when you're like, this is competently done and not more. You know what I mean? Like,
that's fair.
There's nothing wrong with it, but there's also nothing particularly inspired.
Yeah,
right?
it's like your heart's not into
feeling. Yeah, and it's like I can operate at whatever you want to call it, a B level, or I can deliver something that does all the right things, and everyone goes, right. And it's out of my head because it's just, sort of whatever shallowness and what may have you. But the ideal is if you're able to strike something deeper and do something cooler and leave a lasting impression on a reader.
Well, do you feel like reaching the reader, because you've done creator-owned projects and of course worked
a lot,
and worked within the big system with Marvel and stuff? Like, do you feel it's easier to reach that with, like, because you're playing with established characters that people already have feelings about, or do you feel like it's easier to?
That's both, right?
Yeah.
It's weird because it depends on the thing. Like something like Wayward, where this image book that I did with Stephen Cummings and our crew, and we did this story about kind of modern mythologies and
around Japanese culture, right?
Right. It was all Japanese supernatural stuff in the modern world, and this idea of generational divide, and that the old stuff has to give way to the new and all this kind of thing. And so we were able to do exactly the book we wanted to do, the way we wanted to do it. And usually that's a boon. And most of the time on Wayward, it was a boon. But every so often you'd kind of want someone to proofread it over and go, are we still on target? Like, and having an editor and a system and continuity, someone can point and go, oh, that is what Captain America would say, versus he wouldn't, and like you said, the benefit of someone being able to say, I have all these good feelings about these characters already established, and you just slip into it. It's a lot easier in that sense of, I get to, the relationship with a company like Marvel is, depending on how you want to look at it, I've heard it described as symbiotic, and I've heard it described as, kind of carnivorous, right? Like, we're both feeding on each other. Yeah. Like, I'm using their IP and providing a service for them, writing stories, right? And creativity and whatever. But they're also, it's work for hire, and they have they get the commercial benefit of those.
Yeah. Someday your story could be in one of their movies.
Right. And you'll get some pittance, or whatever.
$5,000 they're saying now.
Apparently.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is, you also, from now on, I get to put the word Avengers after my name, right? Like, or Conan the Barbarian, or Samurai Jack, or Rick and Morty, or whatever. And that carries a certain amount of cachet, and it gives me a certain amount of ability and leverage to do other things that I want to do, or do more of those things.
Well, even theme wise, I feel like, because like the comic you did, Glitter Bomb, like the concept behind that is such it's one very rooted in modern society, but also like some pretty deep, dark themes that you wouldn't, I mean, you could do that storyline in an Image comic that you've created from what you've done. Right. But if you were like to throw a storyline similar to that, make it Mary Jane and put it in those, you wouldn't get away
right. Or
with
say,
it,
hey,
right?
let's do Mary Jane or Dazzler in this Hollywood horror. They'd be like, maybe not.
Yeah.
What's really funny to me is, right after Glitter Bomb launched, I've got an agent who represents my media stuff, and that's his favorite story I've done. And so he's like trying to sell it in Hollywood, and I'm laughing because I'm like, you're trying to sell Hollywood on Hollywood is terrible. Like,
yeah, I don't know. You still might hit though. Like David Lynch made a lot of stuff like that, and it
sure
it
does make me laugh though, where it's just like this weird, like, hey, are we terrible? Check this out. We should make a movie about how terrible we are.
We're monsters. Let's go.
We're monsters. Yeah, it's just such a weird kind of. it's like in some ways it's the purest Hollywood where we're like, we'll suck the money out of things that even say we suck the money out of things.
Yeah.
Like, it's ta-da!
It's funny, but it doesn't matter. Like, it really doesn't. You can make like the worst thing that the takedown Hollywood ever, but as long as Hollywood will make money from it, they'll make it. They don't care.
Yeah, and then because they see it as this weird, like, see, we don't mind making.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. That is true.
We can take it.
Yeah,
and we'll cash in at the same time.
Exactly.
It's just like this bizarre kind of experience.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's the industry's always it's this ever moving kind of target, and it's a fascinating kind of challenge for me. I really enjoy the creative process and collaborating with all the different artists and art teams and stuff.
Yeah, we've got to marry several of the things that you love into a lot of your comics. Like, I mean, you mentioned that you were a big D&D guy, and of course you did Dungeons & Dragons comics.
I've been writing the D&D comics since 5th edition launched in 2014. I've written more D&D comics than anyone else now. Wow, which is it's great. It's really great, and isn't stopping. Like, I've got more in the hopper, and the people at Wizards of the Coast have become really good friends, and I now do a lot of other writing for them. So I'm doing not like game product so much, although a little bit of that, but most of what I'm doing is now like I'm doing some development stuff. I'm doing some kind of consulting, and I'm did those the Young Adventurers guides, which are these like through Random House, they publish this group of books that to bring new people into the hobby and things like that. So just a slew of different D&D things that are very much feels like full circle, for playing when I was 8 or 10 years old,
That's so cool. So like for instance, the Rick and Morty project, was that something like, how did that come about? Was it something that you were doing Dungeons & Dragons and they wanted to do a Rick and Morty crossover? You had to pitch that, or?
No, so it was really weird. The way that project happened, Emerald City Comic-Con, I can't remember the exact year, but the editors for Oni Press and IDW, I think some of them went out for dinner and drinks, and they were just hanging out. And then they were like, we should do crazy, crossovers with some of our books. And then over the course of brainstorming, I think at the table, someone said Dungeons and Dragons, Rick and Morty, and everyone laughed. And then one of the editors, Sarah Gaidos, she was like, there's something in that. There's actually, that would be cool.
Absolutely.
And so if I'm not mistaken, it was over that weekend, because she came to me during the convention and just came by my table and we were chatting, and she said, is this something that interests you? And I said, yeah, that would be really cool, but it'll never happen.
Were you a fan of Rick and Morty prior? Or?
Oh yeah. I knew Rick and Morty, and obviously I love D&D. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're talking about Adult Swim's Crown Jewel and Hasbro, who owns Wizards of the Coast. D&D was on the upswing even then. We're talking 3-4 years ago. Like these two megacorps are not going to get along, and they're not going to let the kind of book that Rick and Morty versus Dungeons and Dragons would have to be, where you have to really take pot shots. Like that, neither property is going to let that happen to them.
Yeah, I feel like Rick and Morty probably would. They're pretty good at self-differentiation.
Sure, but it's hard to know, right? Yeah. And so I was like, I just don't see this agreement coming to fruition. Like, yes, I'm absolutely interested, but it's not going to happen. And we laughed about it. And it took them 9 months to get that contract figured out, but they did it. And so eventually Charlie Chu, who's at Oni Press, got in touch with me, and he said, it's happening. And we're in touch with Patrick Rothfuss, the fantasy author, and he's interested in doing it, but he hasn't done comics before. Would you be interested in potentially co-writing with him? And I said, yeah, that would be cool. I've never met him. And they said, well, let's set up a dinner. And so I know for a fact it was a year later, because it was Emerald City Comic-Con the very next year. We went out for dinner, and we were already, emailing back and forth and planning the book out. So yeah, it was weird.
I was enjoying watching some of the, like, you found a way to get the cartoon in there, like the which is such, like, for me, I watched the reruns of that as a kid. Dungeons & Dragons I never really got into, only because I grew up in a very small area, and like literally I could meet nobody else that even heard of it, let alone would want to play with me. So it kind of limits your ability to do it. But I've certainly fell into a bit of role playing later on in life, and it's such a
good.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
It was mainly through Dragonlance, because I used to read those books a lot, and I got really into them. Yeah, and I started looking at those, and then there was the Turtles one, That's the one
Yep.
that I really got into. In the After
Oh
the
yeah, I
Bomb
loved
series.
loved the Turtles role playing game. I've got all those books on the shelf just
Yeah, they're
off
in my
camera here.
library back in.
Yeah, I love them. I've got a whole bookshelf of just role playing games, like
Oh, that's
just top
amazing.
to bottom. I'm pretty obsessed.
Oh,
Um, yeah, and I've played. If you name the game, I've probably played it. Like I played a lot
Army
of
of
role playing
Darkness.
games. Not the role playing game.
There you go.
A friend of mine had it, but I've never played it. That's a
I,
good deep cut though.
I found it at a thrift store the other day, and so I picked it
Nice.
up just because I was like, it's like $1. I'm going to check this out.
Yeah, yeah.
It looks fun.
It's that's a weird one. I gotta admit, that's a deep cut.
Yeah.
But yeah, I played a lot of games, and really, really enjoy them. And lifelong friendships. I met my wife through tabletop gaming, like
Oh
all
wow.
that stuff. So yeah, it's got a deep hold on me. And now it's like I've written. I wrote the Pathfinder comic series. I wrote D&D. I've written for years. I did backup stories in the Munchkin comic.
Mhm.
I'm one of the co-writers on the upcoming World of Darkness event that Vault is doing.
Mhm.
Like the RPG stuff is deep in my blood. I've been doing Gen Con for the last like 6 or 7 years.
Mhm.
I've got a booth that I share with Howard Taylor and Tracy Hickman. So
Oh wow.
yeah, we sell our books together and hang out and stuff. It's pretty
That's
surreal.
yeah. The Dragonland series. I feel like with like the popularity of Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, I'm really surprised
Yeah.
no one's done anything major with that.
Yeah, they've
in a real way.
tried. I know that there's been, it's bounced around Hollywood several times. And I think that it's weird, like you said, with Lord of the Rings and with Game of Thrones and stuff, it feels like it would be a natural epic for them to kind of pick up and give
Yeah.
a go. But I mean, the future of D&D is fascinating because it's never been bigger. And the audience is so young and so vibrant and excited about, the books. It's
And not to,
it's wild.
date us, but there was a time, I mean, myself, I'm about to be 36. So like there's a time
Yeah.
even when I was a kid that it wasn't like cool, but like,
dude, I'm 44.
Yeah, you would know.
I
You would know.
went through the full satanic panic. Like,
Oh, wow. Right. You were there when
yeah,
that was going on.
yeah, my parents took away our books for a while because
Really?
they were worried about it. Yep.
So where would they have gotten that idea from? Is it just the media or was it like the
like it's
local
some
priest
talk
or-
show or something
Oh, yeah.
they had seen? Yeah. And so my mom took away the books. We had a big argument about it. And it's weird because it's like you're really upset, but you don't want to like flip out because then
Yeah.
it's like, well, you're proving this is some sort of an addiction or whatever.
Well, how old would you have been then? Because that's a fairly conscientious thought to make. Like you.
Well, it's like again, you got my older brother, right?
Oh, right, of course, right.
Kind of leading the charge. And so what ends up happening is we convince my dad to play with us for one session to just try it out to see what
Wow.
it's all about. And the kind of best part of it is that my brother is like such a rules lawyer and so by the book. And so he doesn't just like, make a fun version of this to play with my dad. He like takes my dad excruciatingly through the character creation process, like just the most boring, pedantic charts and dice and writing down junk. And then it takes my dad like an hour and a half to make a character because I have to explain every stupid amount of detail. And then he plays for like 20 minutes and his character dies because it's first edition D&D, right? And a bad couple rolls and you're dead meat.
Yeah.
And so dad takes an hour and a half to make a character. It takes like 25 minutes to die. And he's like, what the hell is this? And we're like, that's the game,
Yeah.
And so he goes and talks to my mother, and I'm not making that. We are literally cupping our ears to the door to listen in on this
That's
conversation.
amazing.
And she's like, well, what is it? He goes, it's not satanic. It's just stupid. And she's like, what do you mean?
Endorsement.
He goes, they just write down numbers and they roll dice and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk and they laugh and they talk and they do math. He's like, it's boring and I don't understand it, but they're not causing any problems. Just give them the damn books.
It's so crazy in a modern society that we can still, like, even at that point in our society, but even like with Harry Potter, when people are like saying it's witchcraft just because it's about magic or whatever, like,
Sure.
You get a dragon or a witch or a vampire in it, you think it's some kind of black magic that's going to summon the devil, and it's so insane. There's a great book called Fantasyland by Kurt Lonergan, I think, and he talks about like America's fascination with like magical thinking. Like if I think something's real, it was kind of based around obviously anti-vaccine stuff, but Trump stuff, all that stuff.
Sure.
So and he was talking about the satanic panic stuff, and there's no evidence whatsoever that anything bad happened at any, like, they're devil worshippers. They were taking babies from
but you've got to keep in mind not to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but
Hey, go ahead.
if, how do I put, there is no good way for me to put this, so it's just going to get a little bit awkward, right? But it's like, if the vast majority of your belief system is built around things that can't be proven, then
yeah,
what's
it's
the
easy to accept
difference?
that. You're totally right. I never thought of it that way. But
Right?
yeah, if you're a religious
Like,
person, I suppose, yeah.
if you are very deep within those structures, it's not that different. And if someone in those structures particularly is telling you this is the point of evil, or this is some sort of a particularly terrible thing, just add it to the heap, right? Like,
Yeah,
you know, there's
that's true.
no, you know, yeah.
No,
So,
you're absolutely right. It's an easy transition to start seeing monsters. Like, did you ever watch the movie Mazes and Monsters? The Tom
oh
Hanks?
yeah, oh,
Yeah. Was that part of your
Tell me-
parents' argument?
No. It
Okay.
was just, you know, it was just one of the, when we were kids, we would watch every fantasy movie, right? Because in your head, you wanted it to be as cool as those adventures that we'd made, or the novels that you read.
Yep.
And it was like Conan the Barbarian felt like a badass D&D session, like the original one, the John Milius film from 1980 or whatever.
The second one, like a friend of mine once described the second one as a D&D campaign, because you got
it's a bad D&D campaign.
Yeah, it
like,
is, but you
really,
have like the cast of characters.
sure. It's a really hokey one, but
and Far Cry from the first.
Yeah. And we watched those, you know, we will watch every film with a dragon or a sword, or, you know, you're talking about the heyday of VHS rentals, right? So if the cover looked cool and there was a dude with a sword on it, we wanted to rent it, because we were like, what if this is the one? This is the coolest fantasy. And we watched every bad fantasy movie.
Oh, there's a
multitude of times. Oh, there are tons, man. And they're awful. And we just watch them always with this, like, the premise, you know, hoping that it was the one that was going to be amazing. And very few of them really impressed us. I think, you know, when it was, I think 1998 was the first Lord of the Rings film, or was it 99? Anyways, going to see that in the theaters and being swept along on a full-blown epic fantasy film with no reservations. Like, I didn't have to say, you know, for a low budget crappy fantasy movie, that was okay, or for a 99-cent rental, that was all right. Like, to just walk full-throated out of a fantasy movie and go, that was one of the best movies I've ever seen.
Especially because it came in a wasteland of other fans. Like, there was nothing. I think the only fantasy movie I could think of before that was like the Dungeons and Dragons movie. Which,
but they're terrible.
Yeah, I know, which was far. Like, I remember watching that, being so disappointed.
They're terrible, right? But this is the thing, is that all the, you know, something like Legend, where it's like, it was a higher budget than most other films, is still kind of trash. Like,
it's very weird in that, like,
there's moments that are I think very visually compelling, or there's music, or there's something that's really interesting about it. But as a narrative and as a characters thing, like, there's a film called Lady Hawk that's
I was going to reference that.
Kind of corny, but there's parts of it that work, and there's like, it feels like it has a promise that if it could deliver on, it would be something really good. And instead you're like, you know, for a fantasy movie, that's not bad. Like, but it's always, the filter has to be, considering most of the genre is trash, this is better. And you're like, that's not, you know.
No, but you're right. Like, even Willow, or some of the ones that are like heralded as the classic ones, like, they're okay. It's okay.
They're okay.
I wouldn't say.
You know, and when you're a kid, you're like, oh, Willow's pretty good. And there's no, you know, Mad Mardigan's a fun character, and there's certain combat moments I think are really cool, or certain monsters that stand out to me. And then I think of those, like, the screeching old ladies attacking each other on the climax, and I'm like, woof. Like, it's not good, man. Like, it's not good. You know,
I never saw it as a kid. I only watched it recently, and I was like, it's fine. You know, but
okay.
For the time period, I get it. You know, like, but you're right.
That's the thing is, it was really, the Lord of the Rings is the first fantasy movie I remember seeing without any reservations. Like, I think Conan's a great movie, actually. The only reason why I even have kind of reservations about Conan the Barbarian now is because, you know, the longer I went on and the bigger fan I became of Conan and the original stories, the more I see how far from that John Milius took the character. The character's origin doesn't match the books, and his motivations doesn't match the books. And, you know, to all of his credit, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger looks insanely awesome. But the problem is that because of the point of his career he's at, he's not much of an actor at that point.
No.
So they give him a minimal amount of lines and he comes across as slow and kind of dim-witted for the most part. And the character is not, like in the original prose, that Conan is incredibly smart and has a lot of guile and very, very motivated. And he becomes a leader of men, and then he becomes a king by his own hand. And it's like the character that Arnold plays in that movie might become those things, but he's not really those things.
What do you mean? They did a little bit at the beginning where it showed him old sitting on the...
Whether or not you show that he
I know.
I'm
saying
like,
well, he's old someday. I think they didn't go much further than the name The Barbarian. They're like, oh, he's a barbarian.
Yeah.
Just need a big...
But,
I mean,
so that's the only reservations I have. As a movie, I think it's a wonderful adventure film. I think the action's visceral. I think it's really well written, well edited. One of the, some of those lines of dialogue and narration have become pop culture icons for a reason. They've imprinted themselves upon the property for all time, even though they're not part of the original text. Like, whenever I say to people that I write Conan the Barbarian, inevitably someone's going to say, oh, you're going to do the Riddle of Steel. And it's like, the Riddle of Steel is not a thing. Like, that's a John Milius invention. And it's great, man. Like, it's a really cool idea. And it frames a lot of the action really well. And it's very well done. But it is a construct for that film. You know what I mean?
I feel it probably frustrates the purists as well, because it's not part of the original character. It's sometimes a far cry from what it was initially, but they miss a lot of the things that are really like, it's easy to, it's like the Rambo movie. You watch that movie, the first one, it was pretty close to the book, but they change the ending. And then the next ones, they make them some big action stars.
And it becomes more and more jingoist as it goes along.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, holy crap. Right. Like, but this is the thing is that, so I appreciate Conan the Barbarian as a movie, but it always feels weird as a Conan movie. Like, and now as someone who's been writing Conan for a while, and the fan base is so diverse in the sense that where they came into the fandom and what they're into about it. Like, I've got people who are literally literary scholars who study the works of Robert E. Howard, and everything that is done past the original prose is considered pastiche, and they analyze it in terms of how close it hews to, Robert E. Howard's stuff. And then you've got people who just like grew up on the movie, or grew up on the comics, or grew up on the Savage Sword magazines, or read the Dark Horse series, Kurt Busiek and Carrie Norton, whatever. And they're always framing it in those lenses, right? And or they see the character in very specific manners, depending on how they grew up on the character, whether they see the character as the ultimate macho man, or whether they see the character as, this complex kind of societal, the original Robert E. Howard stories have a very clear theme of like savagery versus civilization, and that the people that build these cities and have these structures, that doesn't make them civilized. If anything, it gives them excuses for being terrible. And some of the most honest and potent people in the stories are the ones that are closest to the earth and closest to, what we would consider barbaric, right?
I find that interesting because the fact that there are these scholars sort of pouring over all these texts, including the comic books and stuff. And then they have to get to like when Marvel makes the Savage Avengers and throws Conan into that. Like, they have to study that too. They're like,
well, I don't know that they study it as closely.
I just like the idea they do. I think it'd be really funny. They're like, oh, he's fighting with the Punisher here.
But then there's other people who just grew up and they saw like, Conan like carrying a woman over his shoulder on a Savage Sword cover, and they're like, yeah, that's a tough guy, and that's what I want to be like. I'm gonna get ripped because Arnold was ripped, and because this dude on these covers is ripped, and he's pure testosterone and killing, and that's what he's all about. And you're like, I mean, he's all these things, he's all these multitudes of influences and cultural baggage and all this kind of stuff. And I'm trying to write the best stories I can that I feel proud of and that I can stand behind and go, I feel like this works. This doesn't discount the stuff from the original, text, but also we have to be able to strike out and tell new stories. Otherwise, what the hell, are we doing? Right.
Absolutely. If your story is just Conan beating up somebody every issue,
again,
it'd be boring as hell.
Oh my gosh, it's a necromancer. What's he going to do?
Instead of making some like, deep philosophical comment about death or mortality or something. It's like, oh, he just
Right.
beats him up and he moves on.
Well, that's the thing is like, so trying to, any of these really long running characters, I think it's a bit of a conundrum where the fan base simultaneously wants the same old thing, but will instantly savage you for it.
Yes.
And they want something exciting, but not too exciting.
Not too exciting, not too different.
Right?
Yeah.
Don't mess it up now.
Me and
And so
Troy talked about that. About like
Yeah.
Star Wars, for instance. They're like,
Yeah,
no, I don't
yeah.
like A Force Awakens. It's too much like A New Hope. And then they did Last
Right.
Jedi. No, I don't like that one. It's too different. It's
Yeah,
like
exactly.
You gotta
Or you're
find
like,
something.
Yeah, and yet if you see the same stuff too many times, you're just like, really, a lightsaber? Oh,
Yeah,
we need a
exactly.
lightsaber, and you're like, you kind of do, guys. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of what people expect.
It's your brand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's that weird thing where when you're trying to come up with new takes on some of these iconic properties, how far afield can you go, and how do you rejig the ingredients in unexpected ways? It's a constant challenge. It's fun, but it's can be brain busting at times.
Well, I can imagine, but with something like Marvel, for instance, you have the constraint of editors and whatever Marvel's planning on doing with something.
Two
later,
levels,
so,
right? Because you've got Marvel. I've got to get through an approval process, and then it goes to Conan Properties, and they have to also approve everything.
I never thought of that.
So yeah, so then they're and sometimes they're usually pretty close in terms of their expectations. Like if it doesn't get past my editor at Marvel, it isn't even going to get to Conan Properties, right? So but yeah, those two levels of approvals. And the good thing is if you're doing it really well and both of them are super enthusiastic, you're like, whew, I just ran the gauntlet and delivered the goods. It's a good feeling. It's nice.
So you did your first comic in 2001, right? That would be Makeshift Miracle, is what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Well, we've jumped all over the place.
I know.
This is good.
I do want to get a little bit of your life.
Try and bring some structure back to this damn conversation.
Actually, I love just talking to people.
No.
That's why I do this. So it's totally the same. But
yeah.
I just want to figure out the timeline as to when you started doing comics.
I went to school for classical animation, so I went at Sheridan College. And then I left to go work in the industry, worked at a small kind of startup animation studio, bounced around a little bit, started doing some teaching at an art college. And then I was working in animation and doing part-time teaching and really creatively unsatisfied because all these jobs were very much about just like, producing someone else's stuff or just grind it out. And I'd taken a break from reading comics for quite a while and then kind of got back into it through web comics. So people were starting to post comics online, and the vast majority of the people that were posting comics online at that point were kind of emulating comic strips. So they would do daily or sometimes twice or three times a week comic strips. And some of them were a lot of like IT humor, because these are all internet nerds or sci-fi stuff or weird kind of slice of life or video gamer kind of comic strips. And I just looked and saw, oh man, there's no publishing filter. Like I don't have to figure out how to get this published. You just make a website and you put this thing on it. I can do that. And so I just started doing a little story that I came up with, and I just did 3 pages a week and literally figured out how to tell a comic story through that, and some of the pages were good, and I was teaching myself Photoshop as I was going and figuring it out. And
awesome. And
if the page sucked, I was like, well, I got to do a better one next time, or if the page was good, I was like, I got to keep that quality going, and it launched September of 2001. And I kept going all the way through to mid-December I don't think I missed an update that first chunk. And built a little reading audience, and would occasionally get a little piece in email and someone telling me it was great or whatever. Someone recommended that I get a PayPal account so I could do a tip jar or something. And every so often someone would drop me a couple bucks and I was like, wow, I made
money from comics,
$20 this month on my comic, or whatever. And then, you would have your strip up top, and then below you would have almost like a blog roll of like, hey, well, here's what's going on with me kind of stuff. And I took a break for the holidays, and it's hard to explain the early internet to people, but it's like
I remember.
If people didn't think your website was updating, there were no RSS feeds to let people know there were updates automatically. So if people thought you weren't updating, they would just take your bookmark off their list and you're dead in the water. It was really hard to get traffic back. And so I knew I was taking a break for Christmas and New Year's. And so I typed this update. I was like, okay, I'll be back in January. Please don't go away. I'm doing the best I can. I know not every page is great, but I'm just trying so hard at just rolling through broken glass, like, oh, don't hate me. And I get this email out of the blue from Scott McCloud.
Oh, wow.
And he goes, the strip's great. Don't be so hard on yourself, looking forward to reading more. And I was just like, oh my God.
Wow.
The Understanding Comics guy is reading my comic,
That's amazing.
And so I emailed him right back and like this fumbling fan letter of, oh my God, Scott McCloud, thank you so much. And I'm trying the best I can and all this kind of stuff, Mr. McCloud, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And he emailed me right back and he said, call me Scott, or just call me. Here's my phone number. And so I jumped on the phone with him and we had a wonderful conversation. And he was saying how the web was this amazing new frontier and all these independent creators were able to create whatever they wanted without any limits. And they didn't have to worry about editors or publishers. And he felt like I was one of a group of people who were on the cusp of doing this stuff. And he said, yours is different because it's a dramatic story. And most people are just doing kind of comedy stuff, and he said, you gotta meet other comic creators. And I was like, how? And he goes like, come to a convention. And so over the next few months, he introduced me to other people kind of in the community and then convinced me, he told me I needed to come to San Diego Comic-Con in 2002. And I was like, there's no way I can do that. Like I had just moved for a new job. So I was in Halifax at that point, actually.
Oh, wow.
Working at an animation studio, just barely getting by, still doing the strips. And I basically said, look, I've got credit card debt. I can't afford a hotel. I can't afford a badge. Mm-hmm. I can't afford a flight. Like this is not happening. Mm-hmm. And so he ended up, through him and some of the other people he introduced me to, someone who was already in San Diego, who was making comics, offered me Crash Space. Someone, Scott himself, it was a different time. You could, like, Scott had enough sway and the show was small enough that he could literally just contact the people in charge and say that I was a professional. So I got a pro badge.
Oh, wow.
And then the last piece was the plane ticket. And so I was talking to my brother about all this and I was like, this is insane, but I can't go. Like, there's no way I can do this. It's impossible. And he was like, what are you talking about? This could be really big. And I was like, oh, maybe next year. It's just not in the cards. Like this, I can't do this. And so he contacted my dad and he basically said, Jim misses out on this opportunity. He's going to regret it forever. And so my dad bought me a plane ticket.
Oh, wow. That's a lovely story.
And it was a very different time where I want you to imagine flying to San Diego. I've never met these people in person. Someone's picking me up at the airport who I've never met before. Like I'm crashing at someone's house I've never met before.
Oh, it's a magical window of like when like the comic industry or the indie comic industry was so small that people were just eager to meet other people that were still doing it, or at least welcome new people in. Now it's so massive.
You just have a quick phone conversation and they're like, well, they don't sound like a serial killer. I guess it's gonna be okay.
Well, I was going to ask you how your parents felt about your career in sort of art, I guess, with animation and stuff. But if your dad was that supportive,
I think they were terrified for a long time that I was going to be, some artist vagrant, unable to support myself, right? Like
with the beret and the beat.
Yeah, the starving artist cliche, right?
Yeah.
Particularly when I was bouncing from city to city or job to job, and nothing seemed consistent, and they were really, really, really worried about it for a while. But thankfully, they also gave me the ability to make my own decisions and figure this stuff out.
That's lovely.
And so that first convention was such a surreal experience. I'm such a child during that whole thing, and I'm bouncing around meeting people and going for drinks and dinner with people whose work I'd grown up with, and just being kind of awestruck by all of it. Mm-hmm. And I came back like, oh, I've got to make stuff. Like I got to really do this, and that powered me through to the end of the, I guess, digital graphic novel, whatever you want to call it, for Makeshift. But then I got kind of work stuff got busy, and I got caught in this trying to figure out what my next step was. The animation studio I was working at, they were having layoffs, and I was crushed in one of the kind of the wheels of changing projects. So I ended up moving back to Toronto and not knowing what I was going to do next. A bunch of my friends had started working in video games, but they had gone back to school for 3D animation. And so I was initially planning to go back to school for 3D, because they were like, oh, if you get the training, then we can probably get you in, at one of these companies, either in Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto or California, somewhere like those, something will pop, because these studios are hiring. And instead, like, I signed up for one of these courses, but then one of my friends I went to school with, this guy Omar, he was working for the Udon studio, and Udon was this little group of artists that were they were based in Richmond Hill, just north of Toronto, in this little office studio kind of space. And they were doing commercial art, and they were doing coloring for Marvel, and they were doing toy design and storyboards, and just whatever kind of catch can kind of work. And I kind of got in there doing some coloring, and hilariously did some comic book coloring for them. So Dark Horse had the rights to the Conan comics, and they were reprinting all the old Marvel stuff. And Udon got hired to recolor some of those original Roy Thomas, Barry Windsor Smith issues. So I colored like 3 issues of Conan. That was like my first, technically amazing. My first published gig.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
Which was super cool, because I was such a huge fan of Conan at the time.
And to be with your first project, that's like, so rare.
It was so bizarre. And then that summer, Udon was doing a bunch of conventions, so I just glommed onto them, went back to San Diego Comic-Con, but now with the studio, went to all kinds of different shows and started networking and meeting people, and realizing how much I loved that aspect of it, just meeting other creators and kind of expanding my knowledge base and whatnot. So I would end up doing some coloring, some freelance illustration, and eventually art directing and project managing at the Udon studio. Wow. So I never ended up going back to school for 3D. By the time we finished that summer, my boss, Eric, he basically said to me, hey, would you stick around instead of going back to school? Why don't you make money here instead of spending money there? And so I stuck around at the Udon studio for years, project managing, and we did a lot of artwork for role-playing games. We did a lot of movie concept art and video game art and advertising art and comic book stuff. The Udon studio got the rights.
Video game stuff, right?
Yeah, the Udon studio got the rights to do the Street Fighter comics.
Right.
And so that's what they got known for. And that was some of my first writing as well, where I really wanted to write comics. And so I ended up writing backup stories for a couple Street Fighter books, and then eventually doing a mini series and all kinds of other stuff. So It was a slow climb. And what I realized was, over the course of years, I was making money, paying off student debt and doing all those things, finally kind of building a financial base. But what I wasn't doing was really being super creative anymore. Like, again, it was that, although it was better projects, it was similar to the animation stuff in the sense you're executing someone else's ideas, to the best of your ability. And even when that's fun, you're like, oh man, I used to get into this. I wanted to tell stories, you know?
I'm sure Zangief versus Ryu, whatever.
No, and you're putting some of yourself into that stuff, but it's still, it's
you are constricted for sure.
Sure. And so at the time, it was like, I had this kind of burning desire to like, I got to make another comic. It's been way too long. I don't have time to draw it. I got no time to put this thing together, but I want to do it, And then one of the artists that I worked with, he had an offer to do a short story in the Pop Gun anthology, which was Image's sort of catch-all anthology they did 3 volumes of.
Yeah, quite a few people got their start there.
A lot. So he got an offer. Chris Stevens got this offer to do a story in that anthology. And I was art directing him on a bunch of Udon work. So he called me up and he's like, is it okay if I do this? I'm like, yeah, you're not on an exclusive contract. I don't care. Like, hit your deadlines. And he's like, oh, cool. Okay. And then he called me like a few hours later and he goes, I thought I was going to be drawing someone else's story. They want me to make my own story. I was like, oh, that's amazing. And I'm like, what are you going to do? And he's like, I have no idea. And so over the phone, we brainstormed a thing. And he was like, cool, I'm going to do it. And then like 2 days later, he called me up and he goes, it was funnier when you said it over the phone. Do you just want to write it? And I was like, yeah, I'll write it. And so I wrote this 10-page story called 2 Copper Pieces that he fully digitally painted. And It went over really well. Eric Larson, who was publisher at Image at the time, contacted me and said, "This is awesome. Do you guys want to do more comics?" And I was like,
Wow.
yes, like
Yeah.
desperately with all my being, you know. And so we slowly started pulling together this concept that we'd eventually call Skull Kickers, which was sort of all my Dungeons and Dragons energy from when I was a kid, filtered through this cynical kind of aren't fantasy stories and stories about destiny stupid kind of mentality. And so it was this, you know, sword and sorcery action comedy that Chris and I, and eventually Edwin Huang, came on as the regular interior artist for the series, and we carried through and launched in 2010. And that was the first time that, even though I'd been going to conventions for years, it was always with the Udon Studio or as the project manager guy or like convention booth organizer guy.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden people were like, "Oh, you wrote this? This is really good," or "This is really funny," you know? And it really unlocked this, like, oh, what have I been doing this whole time? Like, I'm glad I did that. And I learned a lot about the industry and publishing and art. And, but I hadn't been making my own stuff, you know?
Actually, we have a slight connection through Skull Kickers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was some project or some contest they did one time. I want to say like maybe 10 years ago, where they submitted a script of 2 pages and they had artists send one in. I sent one in. So
oh, nice, that's great.
I didn't win, of course, but it was still cool. Yeah, it was still neat to do.
My God.
I came across it the other day and I was looking at it. I was like, oh yeah, like I kind of forgot about that.
You know, that was so fun, and that was really like I wanted to give someone, you know, the leg up on you know, their own start, because I felt like the anthology had done that for me. So
that's
I thought,
really
why not?
cool.
I control this book. I can do it however I want. I'll do a backup story. Someone can do it. Mm-hmm. What's funny is the guy who won that contest, Aubrey Sitterson, he's doing all kinds of stuff at Dark Horse now.
Oh, wonderful.
So,
that's awesome.
Yeah, he's been doing.
No,
stuff
it's great.
years.
I thought it was a cool opportunity and it was a fun little thing to do. So
yeah, it was a lot of fun. And so doing that book, even still, like, it's not like I did that book and a month later Marvel and DC were knocking at the door. Like, like we produced, I think I didn't start getting other freelance work for writing until maybe Skull Kickers 9 or 10. Mm-hmm. So we'd been putting that, and it took us more than 10 months to put out 10 issues. I
was going to say probably a couple of years, or at least a year.
Yeah, almost 2 years. And so in that time, and even then, my first writing gig came about because of my RPG connections. So because the Udon Studio had done artwork for Dungeon and Dragon magazine, which at the time were published by Paizo. Paizo eventually broke off from Wizards of the Coast and started making a thing called Pathfinder. Yeah. And so when Pathfinder licensed their property to Dynamite to make comics, Eric Amona, the publisher there, he had read Skull Kickers, really liked it, and thought I would be a really good fit to write their comic series. Wow. And so he kind of said, look, if you hire Jim, approvals are going to go real smooth. And they were like, smooth approval sounds great. And so they reached out to me and I started writing the Pathfinder comics. So
that's amazing. It sounds like quite a lot of fortuitous events that combined with hard work. It's kind of got you to the place you're today.
Yeah, it's like you can look at it and you can go, there's a lot of kismet, but it's like I try and say to people, I go, you know,
you need the talent when the opportunity comes.
Well, but a lot of it is right place, right time. So you need to create places and times, right? So if you create enough places and times, something will spark off of each other, right? But if you don't create like years worth of conventions, and Udon was doing 12 to 15 conventions a year, right? You know, years of producing work and putting it in people's hands and hoping that it you know, sparked something inside them or whatever. And slowly but surely someone gives you a leg up or says, oh, this is cool, or recommends it to a friend or whatever. And that's kind of how these things roll. You know, it's weird.
Yeah, but it definitely started a chain reaction. I wanted to ask you about, because you've done Marvel with work with Marvel doing Thunderbolts, Candy Avengers. So you created a Canadian superhero from the ground up for Marvel Comics, and I was wondering just about the impetus of that. Was it just you just injected it because they wanted a new character, or you just felt like maybe Canadians weren't represented as well as they could be in the superhero world?
So the first few things I did at Marvel, like I did a bunch of ad work and things like that. But the first kind of in continuity superhero stuff I did was Thunderbolts. And I was so nervous about that series. I was like, I'm not a real Marvel writer unless I use all that continuity, right? So for me, that series is plugged to the brim with like old school references to old Thunderbolt stories or continuity for the Winter Soldier, all that stuff. Because it was like in my head, real Marvel writers use all the continuity and leverage all the classic stuff. And I was terrified of making anything new because it's like, I think in my mind, I thought, well, then they'll just think I'm being indulgent instead of being a real Marvel writer or whatever. And then Uncanny Avengers, midway through my run on that, I needed a character to do something in a story. And I was talking to my editor, Tom Brevoort, and I said, oh, can I use so-and-so? And he said, no, they're being used in another story for another thing. But you could just make another character that does the same thing. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, Jim, that's how we made the Marvel Universe. And I was like, oh my God. And so I came up with a thing. And like the day after that issue came out, some fan updates the Marvel wiki, and now it's part of the Marvel Universe and whatever. And you're just like, oh shit, I can make things. Yeah. Oh man, this is addicting. And so we did the Avengers Weekly event and we made a bunch of new stuff in there. And then when I was taking over Champions, Mark Waid had been writing the series for a year and a half, almost 2 years. And I was taking over and I needed to put my stamp on it, like do something different. And one of my long-term goals was I want to create teenage superheroes all over the world. That there are teenagers that we can aspire to in the Marvel Universe everywhere. You know what I mean? And if I'm going to do it, the first one, I'm going to be indulgent and make it my country. So let's do Canada, right? And if we're going to do Canada, then let's do something that's pretty underrepresented which is Indigenous. And that became the fulcrum for the character, because a great Marvel character has feet of clay. They have a deep-seated problems or issues that are usually very internal in nature. And so the idea of this young girl who has been gifted with some of the magical power of the myth of the North, of the indigenous people of the North, but she doesn't believe in it. She doesn't want to be like, she just wants to live her life as a young modern girl. She doesn't want to hew to the old ways and all that kind of stuff. So she's at conflict with herself, you know what I mean? And she simultaneously has to be this symbol of something that she's not even sure she can do. And that to me felt like a real classic Marvel conflict, while also being representative, while also, teeing up the potential for all sorts of stories.
And quite relatable for a teenage character.
Exactly. Who doesn't know, like a lot of people don't know if they want their family's traditions, or don't know that they want to do things the way their parents or grandparents did. But there's something important about tradition. There's something important about history, whether or not you love it, it's a part of you. You know what I mean? And so that was something I felt really strongly about. And when I pitched the concept to Marvel, they were down for it. But we agreed that we needed to walk very carefully because it could easily slip into stereotype or what may have you. Yeah. And so I reached out through a friend of mine, introduced me to this filmmaker named Nyla Inukshuk. And she, documentary filmmaker and director, she had been making all sorts of films, and she was originally from, up in, why am I brain farting?
That's all right, no worries.
On up in the North. Wow, I am totally blanking right
now.
The
province or the
like
Northwest Territories, the Yukon.
It's not even called that anymore, though. It literally has its own name. Nunavut. Jeez, man. Yeah. People are going to watch this and they're going to be like, nice job.
We're ready to represent Canada.
You literally forgot Nunavut. It's like, shit. Anyways.
It's the newest one. It's fine. It took a while.
No, it's not. Anyways, but so she came on board as a consultant, and we created the character together, essentially. So she was really instrumental in figuring out some of the intrinsic elements of the character and how to represent that stuff and how to show it in these dramatic stories, and what her power set could be, and what the communities up there are like for real, and all that kind of stuff, and tons of photo reference to make sure that we didn't screw it up.
I love that they went that extra mile to make sure that was legitimate and well represented, because Marvel,
and she ended up co-writing. We did a Champions annual all about Snowguard, all about that character. Amka, and so she co-wrote it with me, which was a real joy
very
as
cool.
well. And then Marcus Toe, who's another artist here in Toronto, so it's like all Canadian creative team. We busted that sucker out. It was a lot of fun. It was a real pleasure. The week that like when they announced that character, Marvel was really taken aback by the response, because just the confluence of events was really rich. I was finishing this Avengers Weekly event. The Avengers movie was coming out, Infinity War. And then because the comic solicits are 4 months ahead.
Yes, yep.
We announced this new Canadian superhero.
Mhm.
And so the Canadian press basically goes, the writer of the Avengers is Canadian and he made a new Canadian superhero.
Mhm.
And it's like these things, and Avengers is the biggest movie in the world.
Yeah.
These things are all true, but they're just like fusing it into one through line. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it meant that in 1 week, I did like 6 radio shows. I did the National. I did CBC twice.
Wow.
Toronto Star, Globe and Mail. Like, it was nuts.
Well, Canadians are very quick to hop on anything that can get Canada recognized on a global level, because it seems like we're always sort of like, I don't want to make a generalization, but it does seem like as far as contributions to the world go, Canada's never really mentioned a lot.
Right, right.
You
and
know,
then it fit,
especially in media, like fiction.
Yeah, on the pop culture sphere, Avengers was on the tip of everyone's tongue.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And so it was just, this confluence was so strong, and so the first appearance of the character instantly sold out, and went to second printing and all this.
Well, and
stuff.
also there's as far as Indigenous representation in comics goes, there's not a ton. Like even within Marvel, there's like the shaman from Alpha Flight, and I could probably not name.
There's a handful of characters.
Maybe Puma from Spider-Man.
There's a couple others, but they also tend to again lean into a lot of heavy stereotypes and what may have you. And
well,
so
even now with the Captain America initiative they're doing with the bunch of different worlds, there's a Native American version.
Yes.
Actually, an old roommate and friend of mine is doing the art for that. David Cutler.
Oh, cool.
Have you met David?
That's awesome. I don't know that I have.
Anyway, it's cool. But I was talking to him a little bit about it, and just like, he was just saying there's so much blowback from people complaining online about it, and how that sort of got him down a bit. And I was like,
well, and trying to strike that balance between being representative but not being stereotypical, and finding that, I don't know that there is a perfect line.
Well, the blowback wasn't because it was stereotypical. It was just that Captain America is Native, Native American, and like that's it's just racist assholes online. But but still they have voices, and sometimes they're quite loud.
And so for us, it was a really fun and weird moment. Like. I remember I went to the Calgary Comic Expo and my phone was just blowing up. I was literally tucking behind the drape and doing like a radio interview, and stuff like that. And then I would come back out and someone would bring me the comic to sign or whatever, or someone wanted me to draw the character for them, because they were like so excited, this new Canadian superhero. And I just thought, wow, this is so surreal. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. Really glad we did it. And when I wrapped up my run on Champions, the only thing I said to the next writer was, I said, please don't shunt Snowguard off the team. Like, when I did that, one of the cliches of those Marvel stories from the 70s and 80s in particular, they would go to some exotic part of the world and they would introduce a new superhero, the superhero of fill in the blank, right? The rainforests of South America or whatever. And then that character would be stuck there, and you'd only ever see them when they go to that place, and they would just pop their head up and go, I'm the hero of wherever, or I'm Shillelagh, the Irish superhero.
They did that so much with the X-Men, because they just put a mutant in some random spot.
Exactly.
Here's Sunfire. He's like,
right. And so every time we go to Tokyo, Sunfire shows up.
Yeah,
and it's like, I wanted Snowguard to join the team and just be a regular part of the team. That was kind of the point, was that she joins them. And over time, we would add more of these heroes from different parts of the world. And I just said, please don't immediately exile her out just because I'm not writing it. And they've been very kind, and they've kept her around, and she's still doing stuff. And that's kind of the best compliment, is if the character can outlast you and keep going, right?
Well, that's interesting, because I don't think I've talked to someone who's created, I guess I have before, but like that's created sort of one of these characters that sort of is introduced in a team book, not started in their own comic, and then to see what the legacy is as they go on. Like I remember when
Yeah.
they would try to do some of these side characters or give them these new ones they created, they never seem to last very long, or they'd always get sort of shuffled off to be in like Avengers Academy.
Well, and inevitably the next creative team comes on and they want to make new stuff. And
Yeah.
they're like, well, out with the old and in with the new. And I get it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's not to say that Snow Guard is the main character, because she's not. Like,
No.
you know, Miles Morales and Kamala Khan and Sam Alexander are ostensibly the trio at the core of Champions. But the fact that she's still there and still doing stuff, I think matters and has
Absolutely.
a place, you know? Yeah.
It always kills me when, like, you know, someone create like Gravity, that character, or one of those characters that Marvel created, and then they're just in the background, and then they just kill them off somewhere, and it does, like, it's like, I think it was it Wolverine Enemy of the State when they killed off like one of the slingers, and I was like, no, like,
see, one of the awkward thing is you need to refresh the kind of teen pool with new characters, but the old characters don't get much older, so it's like this awkward frozen, like, you know,
there's no passing of the torch. There's just
the new Warriors can't be the old Warriors, but they're also not the new Warriors anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like you have this awkwardness where you're like, how many teen characters have you piled up against the barrage?
Yeah.
But you can't, if you say that they're older, then how old is Spider-Man and how old is, you know, Scarlet Witch or one of these legacy characters? How old is Janet Van Dyne? That's impossible. She's got to be what, 30 but
yeah. No,
but
absolutely.
she's not, and she is, and it's like that time thing that we were talking about before, right? So
very cool.
Yeah.
I guess I want to ask you as well about Rick and Morty.
Sure.
I know we were talking about it earlier, but because I'm a huge fan of that show, and I mean, I've
too.
talked to Troy a bit about the property since he's more working on it with you. But like that show is so, like, I always reference the sort of cosmic horror elements of it, the you know, the internal stuff, the super philosophical and pretty dark stuff about the inward issues with people in general, like translating that into something that combines with something that's kind of fun and fancy free, like Dungeons and Dragons. Like you guys did an awesome job. I love the series.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
But
Pat was intrinsic to that first miniseries being as good as it was.
Mhm.
And I knew we were gonna create something like deeper when he came to me with essentially like a mandate. Like he said, okay, we have to, we can't just play into the stereotypes of the basement boys in D&D, because that's no longer D&D.
Yeah.
And we can't just hit the high spots and make all the Rick and Morty characters be unlikable. We have to dig deeper beneath the surface and get some emotional content. And, you know, characters like Jerry in that first miniseries, we plumbed surprisingly deep with him, you know, and even Rick himself and some of his foibles and why he acts the way he acts. And that is some of the most satisfying stuff in that miniseries for me, but it was some of the hardest stuff to kind of, you know, figure out.
Yeah, but it translates well because I love the show for a lot of reasons, but there is a little bit of everybody in all those characters, I think, and that's what makes it, even Jerry, who is probably one of my favorite characters. Because like that sort of you know, loser type character that just and in the show they've mined so many things that sort of that pull that out of you. The one
and
that
some of the episodes, you can tell some of the writers clearly like Jerry, and some of them loathe him, and he's the butt of every joke. And it's like trying to find a balance where, yes, he is a loser, but he still has validity somewhere in the mix, I think is the balance, you know.
Well, they did a good job with that, I think, in when they brought him and Beth back together, and they sort of acknowledged that he actually, at his heart of hearts, like, he's a decent person. He's just really bad at executing that.
Exactly.
But yeah, like, there's just such deep stuff in what they do. Like, I often reference the episode, I think it was from season 4, the one with the toxic versions of themselves, and how, like, if you could remove everything you think is bad about yourself, are you still you, and what does that mean? And it's just like deep levels like that I felt you guys kind of reached into with that, which I thought was really cool.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
The second mini series was nerve-wracking at first because, you know, if people liked it, great, but if they didn't, I couldn't just, you know, say, well, that was Pat Rothfuss, you know, or whatever. Like, it's all my fault now, you know. Trying to find something equally deep to say in the sequel. That's where I struck upon the idea of, you know, when I was a kid, and so many people, you would make all these extra role-playing game characters that you would never have a chance to play. And so this idea of this like folio of loser characters that never got off the ground. And because there are infinite number of dimensions out there somewhere, they must really exist, and they must hate Rick very much, you know.
Yeah.
And what does that say about you in your youth? And you hate who you were growing up, or you know, all the mistakes that you used to make coming back to haunt you, in this case, quite literally.
Yeah.
And so we were able to kind of mine this emotional quality of Rick in a different fashion, you know, and then playing that off of Jerry, who we established in the first one had played D&D before, and then showing him as a kid and his own desires to be a hero and all that kind of stuff, and how that plays against in reality. And then the simple duality of, in the first miniseries, Rick, Morty, and the family go to the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons, and in the sequel, the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons come to, you know, their house, right? So it was just being able to flip a bunch of those switches and mine new drama out of it, you know.
Well, I'm so glad it happened, because Rick and Morty does lend itself. They do a lot of parodies, obviously, like they recently did Voltron. So you know, it lends itself to that, and it was so cool. But
we've got a brand new story in the deluxe edition.
Yes, which I'm looking forward to reading very much. So
yes, so that the premise on that was really simple. I actually pitched it in an email initially. I just said, what if a Meeseeks box ended up in the Forgotten Realms? That was it. How would people react to its magic, and what would happen next? And everyone was like, oh no. And I was like, yeah, let's go. And they just got me free reign to do this 30-page monstrosity of chaos and violence. And
dude,
yeah,
your sandbox wild. Is amazing, and I'm happy you get to play in it, because I'm really
thanks, man.
Output for sure. But any projects coming up you want to talk about, or anything like that?
I've got a few in the hopper. So when we record this, it's a day before Avengers Tech-On launches. So that's a really kooky partnership between Bandai Japan and Marvel Entertainment. They've got this line of amazing posable, like, metal action figures. And it's this, do you know the term tokusatsu, which is like the Japanese special effects shows? So like Power Rangers.
Yep.
The Power Rangers is the most famous example of it, but there's dozens and dozens.
Oh, the old Ultraman, all that sort of stuff.
All that stuff. Yep. And so we're taking that mentality and amping it up in the Marvel universe. So the Avengers lose their superpowers because the Red Skull basically finds a kind of the dust of the Infinity Gems that is scattered in the atmosphere, gathers up that dust and gets enough energy to execute this wish, which is to remove all superpowers. And so the only person who's got a real advantage now is Tony Stark. So he ends up making these power suits for all the Avengers, and they're going to fight against Red Skull and his like army of crazy monsters and villains and stuff. And so it's this very over the top, dramatic action adventure, colorful thing. Jeff Cruz, the artist on it, is phenomenal. He's drawing it and coloring it, and he has this very animated look to his artwork. It's super dynamic. I love his stuff so much, and I've been wanting to work with him for years, and he is just crushing it. It's just fun. It's fun stuff. And the fact that there are these amazing action figures that they've built for this toy line around it is like icing on the cake. So we just get to make all this wild, cool stuff.
That's lovely. That's awesome.
So that launches this week. I've got more, I'm doing the anniversary issue of Conan the Barbarian. So our 25th issue is, if you do legacy numbering on the series, it's issue 300. So we're doing this huge anniversary issue. We've got a bunch of cool stories and creators in there. And Corey Smith, who's the regular artist with me, we do this big anniversary story that is just like over the top, very classic kind of pull out all the legendary sort of stuff. I'm super happy with it. I've got the new Dungeons and Dragons miniseries starts up in September, and that's called Mindbreaker, and it acts as sort of a soft prequel to the Baldur's Gate 3 video game. And then I'm one of the co-writers on Vault's World of Darkness event, which is Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf the Apocalypse smashing into each other.
Those are names I haven't heard in a long time.
Yeah, so I get to write this amazing pack of werewolves who are causing all sorts of damage to the vampires that have been established in Vault's vampire series. So yeah,
it's amazing. Well, I look forward to reading it all.
A lot of fun stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Well, it was great talking with you.
And you.
I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye. There you have it, my interview with Jim Zub. Big thanks for Jim for coming on, and once again, Troy for making the introduction. I'm going to go because it's hot. Very hot. I think it's the hottest day in record here in Nova Scotia, and I am melting, literally melting, like the movie Street Trash, in which a bunch of homeless people drink Tenafly Viper wine, which makes them melt into a toilet. I feel like that is happening to me, minus the drinking of the alcohol. But the melting is what seems to to take precedence. That's a deep cut for you, you horror exploitation lovers out there. Yeah, so thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe and all that jazz. I assume you're subscribing already. If you're not, please do so on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, share. Share the story. Share the posts that, let you know new episodes are out. Let friends know. Just tell everybody that you know to come listen to the show. This is a labor of love for me, and I would like to know that other people are getting something from it as much as I am. I really fully engage in these conversations, really enjoy them, and always take something away from it. And I feel like listening to passionate, creative people talk about their journeys, their stories, fears, desires, challenges, and conquests is very interesting to me, and I think you do too if you're still listening. So maybe you can reach out, share something, and let somebody else know about it. And thank you for listening, thank you for tuning in, and be sure to be back here in a fortnight for our next episode.